This is Roger Simon.
And Lionel Chetwynd.
Welcome back to Poliwood. We are here this time with a special guest, Matt Atchity,
Thank you.
the editor-in-chief of Rotten Tomatoes. Rotten Tomatoes, as most of our audience knows, is the major site on the internet for aggregating movie reviews. Matt, tell us how Rotten Tomatoes got started and when you got started with it.
I've been with Rotten Tomatoes for about 3.5 years as editor-in-chief. Prior to that, it was run by Sen Duong, who started the site in '99. And he was inspired, he was a Jackie Chan fan, and he started looking for reviews for one of the Rush Hour movies. And he started getting reviews all over the web, because that was right around the time everybody started publishing reviews to the web. The newspapers were making the leap. So he started looking for reviews, and he thought, you know, maybe I should start running some kind of percentage as to who likes the movie and who doesn't. And lo and behold,
Rotten Tomatoes.
a legend was born.
How popular is Rotten Tomatoes? What's your
We're, you know, depending on the month, we're on average probably around 7 or 8 million uniques a month, according to ComScore.
The thing about Rotten Tomatoes, great timing. Obviously, it was a matter of timing. He was there at the right time. But in any event, you're now right in the primordial soup. I mean, you know probably more at Rotten Tomatoes about what's going on out there than anyone. And the thing that's fascinated me is in following Rasmussen's measure of how the political class is disconnected from the American people, sometimes 80-20 reversals. What about the film audience? To what extent are the critics, when I grew up, the critics could determine the fate of a film. To what extent do the critics reflect their audience? Or is there the same disconnect between critics and the audience?
I don't think that there is that big a disconnect. Now, there are a lot of journalists out there who like to point to when a movie does really well on our tomato meter. Or conversely, what they like to point to especially is when a movie does badly on the tomato meter and does really big box office. And we run a user score. Almost every big movie site runs a user score. They allow users to come in and score the movies. So something like Transformers 2 a couple years ago. Transformers 2 was at 22%, which is pretty low. 22% of critics liked it, which means 78% of them hated it or didn't like it. But that did huge box office numbers. So a lot of and the initial user score was very high. It was very like up in the 80%. So a lot of people like to point and say, people went and saw the movie and the user score is high. That means the critics are out of touch. I actually don't believe that that's the case at all for a couple of reasons. First of all, the user score comes from what ultimately is a self-selecting pool of people, right? And it's not that you can't trust the user score. It's that you have to put the user score in perspective. A user score for any site, same thing on IMDb. It's people, they have a lot of motivation. It's people, you know, especially initially, it's people who went and saw that movie on the opening weekend. Now, as a culture, most people are very good at picking movies that they think they're gonna like. Usually they're right. So you're kind of getting, it's not quite preaching to the choir, it's getting the feedback from the sermon from the choir.
But it's a double redundancy. I'm going to this movie because I like it and I came out
and
like
so,
it.
And then if you like it, you came back and said, and if you really liked it, then you're motivated enough to go and rate it.
The user score then is sort of like Ron Paul on internet polls.
Sort of.
But you know, it probably explains a lot about the initial weekend of Atlas Shrugged,
Yes,
where it came sweeping in. Yeah.
Right. You know, the other issue is critics need to go, you know, your average critic has to go see everything or sees most of what's out there. You know, I do some movie reviews myself, not on RT, but I do them with another group. I have to go see 2 or 3 movies a week. And quite often it's movies I don't particularly want to see. You know, when people say, oh, you're complaining about having to see a movie, I say, yeah, you know what? I had to see Sex and the City 2 last year. That movie stunk. I had no interest. I'd never seen an episode of the show. I had to go see that. You know, I had to go see a movie called The Roommate this year. A terrible movie. So if everybody that was rating movies saw movies kind of in the paradigm that critics go and see them, go and see stuff that they have to see, force themselves to see movies that they're, you know, the 18-year-old fanboy going and seeing the British talkie drama, right? Chances are, you know, the other thing I think that happens, and this is kind of going off on a tangent, I think that the more movies you see, your tastes start to change. Yeah, you know,
I think absolutely.
Right? Music,
right.
Like
everything else. Yeah.
You'd be shocked. Well, you guys probably know this, like, the average American, do you guys know how, like, average American, how many movies do you think they see in theaters per year?
1.
5, right? Now, those of us that see, that's boom. You guys are actually, you're the first one I've actually heard under undercount that. But that's nothing,
lot of
right?
people there know.
Like, as someone who goes
Well,
and
how
sees,
many movies are they seeing a year if you count what they're uploading and seeing on DVDs?
that's right.
That would have been higher.
Yeah, that's going to
Now
be
that's
higher.
that is much higher.
And
That is
that's
much
going
higher.
to go higher and higher.
Right.
and
That's
as it
probably
becomes
at this point probably 30, 40.
Well, so that's a fair amount then. So it's interesting. And it would be interesting to know, maybe you do know, how these numbers compare with 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
That's a good question. It's tough to determine 20, 30 years ago because, we run numbers for movies that are 20, 30 years old. But it's a combination of whatever reviews were available that have been archived and put online. So, Roger Ebert's put all of his reviews going back to 1963 or whenever online. But Pauline Kael's aren't online. So Pauline Kael is
getting Moulton, but not Walter Kerr.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what happens too is that, I've talked to Moulton about this. Moulton's at a point where he kind of won't bother reviewing something that he doesn't like because his attitude is who has the time, right?
Well, sure, but that's not the reviewer's job.
Right.
This is really interesting because we're talking about business models and why we seem unable in the United States to make films like The King's Speech that do very, very well out there. Is it something in the audience that you've seen or in the critical community that makes it harder for an American film like Get Low to break through the market than a film like King's Speech?
I don't think so. I think that people, and kind of going back to your first question, a guy at Slate, Eric Lundegaard, ran this great study about, and it's not necessarily about causality, but there's a correlation between good reviews and bad reviews and box office, and to the point that if you look at the per screen average, a well-reviewed movie, chances are 9 times out of 10 is going to make anywhere from $500 to $2,000 more on the per screen average, according to the box office. Now that adds up, right? And so what that tells me is that word of mouth and good movies end up getting better box office, right? I think that, and it kind of says that to me that the critics kind of match up with the general taste. Now, as far as smaller films, that's where you see the bigger variation. It's the smaller movies that you'll see that difference of $2,000. I think that critics can really move the needle on a smaller film. A great example of that was The Hurt Locker. And Summit.
Well, that's Summit. That's
right.
where A Better Life is coming.
Right.
Let me ask you.
I want to ask about A Better Life.
A Better Life is an example of
That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
that budget level, which is.
Well, and you guys probably know this as much as I do. I think that it's a change in the business model. When I first started out covering movies on the web 15 years ago, every weekend, one of the things I would always do was talk about, put up a little article that was talking about the movies that are opening each weekend. And I remember very distinctly, there were always 4 or 5 wide releases. Always, always, always. Now we're down to 1, 2. The studios have really cut back on the amount of movies that they're willing to do. And what's happened is that you've got this really big dichotomy. It's either these huge blockbuster marketing films that are marketing driven, right? And you're seeing this in TV too, right? Cartoon Network won't do a show unless there's a toy line. It's kind of the same thing that's happening in movies. What other kind of ancillary marketing, what kind of big marketing partnerships can we do? And then you've got the small films that sometimes are, a studio that the Weinsteins will buy after the film's already been made, right? It's something that's smaller, that's less than $20 million, a small film that they think that they can then do kind of an old school platform release, because nowadays everybody wants to open in, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 theaters.
Well, The Bridesmaids sort of got in the middle of
Yeah,
that.
well, that's a popular comedy, whereas the artsier movies are trapped in the model that he's describing. I mean, The King's Speech, had it not won the Oscar, would have disappeared in this country, more or less. Hard to say, but it wouldn't have done what it did, that's for sure. But anyway, let's turn back to Rotten Tomatoes for just a second. One of the things that's always interested me is you divide up your critics between what's called homespun critics, like bloggers, et cetera, and the big-time critics at the New York Times, et cetera. How do you make that differentiation? And
It's really about reach. So we've got kind of 2 tiers. There's the general critics pool, which at any given time there's probably 300-400 active critics. So a big movie, something like Cars, will probably see upwards of 200 reviews, right? Because one outlet like the New York Times may have 3 or 4 reviewers, but they're probably only going to run one review from that. Of those critics,
So will you count all 4 reviews in your percentages, or?
if they run if the New York Times were to run 4 reviews of the same movie written by different people, all of those would be counted. But if one person wrote a review or wrote separate reviews at multiple outlets, they only get 1 vote. It's one person, 1 vote. It's not one company, 1 vote.
You can't stuff the newspapers.
It's really about
So you
reach.
don't distinguish between, let's say, Gloria Pugh on USA Today and Joe Morgenstern on Wall Street Journal. It could not be more different.
Right. I mean, ultimately, does Claudia reach more people because she's writing at USA Today than maybe Joe is? She might be. They both fall in the top critics umbrella,
obviously.
right? Roger Ebert. It's the people. It's the top 10% of the critics, of the reach. It's the biggest names, the people that are, if not household names, close to it, right? Whereas somebody who's writing for, IGN Movies, a site, the guys that I know and love, those guys aren't going to be top critics. They don't have the reach.
How do they make it to become that?
It's mostly about the reach. It's mostly how big, or conversely, if it's somebody that we think their quality of writing, that my staff and I think that the quality of writing is such that they absolutely need to be a top critic. There are some people.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
Sitting where you are, if you were young, what advice would you give someone trying now to come into this industry and build a career?
In criticism or making movies?
Making movies.
Gosh, I don't know. If I knew that, I'd probably be making movies myself. I would say my take on it is I think that there's, with digital photography, the barrier of entry to getting a movie to making your own movie is far lower, if only for digital filmmaking, right? I remember I had friends in film school that are my age that you're making your student film and you had to drop, 10, 20 G's just getting your film developed, right? That cost has evaporated, right? If you know your way around a computer, you can probably do some decent special effects. You look at those guys who did Primer at Sundance a few years ago, which, won at Sundance. That's a fantastic movie. I think that if you are really willing and have the wherewithal, make your own movie, shoot your own movie and get it out there. And there's no better experience than just trying and making it yourself. There's a lot of good books out there. There's a lot of people who've talked about how to do movies on your, Robert Rodriguez, Robert Townsend, people talk about how to finance and kind of get your own movie done. I think you could probably, if you really wanted to, especially in a big city where there's an acting community, you could probably get your own movie, maybe not feature length, but you could start doing short films relatively cheaply, and hit the festival circuit. And it's like with anything, keep working at it. It's just like a musician. How does a musician succeed? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice.
Practice.
It's the same thing.
Well, thanks a lot, William Atchity, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'll all be watching Rotten Tomatoes, as we always do, to check out the reviews of Lionel's next movie and other next movies. This is Roger Simon.
And Lionel Chetwood.
Next week in Poliwood.